Hello, this is Michael Hexter. Welcome to Politics 2100 here on YouTube. So, this episode I'm calling The Case for From the Ground Up Critique of Marx, the Ongoing Poverty of Theory. So, this sounds like, for people who don't like the word theory or critique or Marx, even, might sound like kind of a gray and dull idea. And I'm going to try to make the case here that it's not a gray and dull idea, and it's very relevant to practice and to political activism, and also why we need this from the ground up critique, this fundamental critique of Marx. So, anyway, just to sort of take a step back about theory, the poverty of theory part. So, I think because progressives are trying to make a world that hasn't yet really existed, and we're creating something that is, maybe we're on the trajectory to go. In other words, maybe we have the momentum going in this direction, but we still need to create it. It needs to be a social construction of the society we want to make. So, and that's really the case really for any change in society, even a reactionary change. There need to be people who visualize it or conceptualize it and also write it down, especially if it involves laws. They need to write it down into legal proposals, bills that then become laws. So, anyway, the theory is really the basis, the background for how those proposals get generated in the first place. And so theory is the sort of the overarching social philosophy and ideas that people share in a movement, let's say, or in a collection of movements that share a common interest or set of interests, so they can unite and then create this new reality through in my opinion, it has to happen through the legislation eventually. But the creation can happen on the ground. It can be spontaneous. There can be, you could say, private sector or whatever, or non-public, spontaneous communitarian actions that people take that don't require immediately some kind of legislative change. In other words, people they vote with their feet, they do things, and then later on, maybe there needs to be laws that legislate or create. If there are conflicts of interest, which there inevitably will be among groups of people, so forth and so on, that they need to be somehow adjudicated. So sorry to sound like such a realist, or I don't know, maybe I'm not, but to sound like such a spoil sport, to think about nice ideas also having downsides. But anyway, I still think we need to have good ideas, and we need to have motivating ideas, and ideas that are inspirational and visionary. So I'm not just because I see the potential for the creation of a legal architecture and potential for conflicts of interest and so forth and so on, that doesn't mean that new vision doesn't need to happen and doesn't need to spring forth out of our minds and so forth and so on. And we need to talk about it. We need to visualize it together, and then act on it, and then make that thing happen. So anyway, so theory is where that happens. So theory is one way to talk about that. The problem is that theory has been restricted to, among other things, to Marx, okay, or let's say the Marxist tradition is very strong on the words theory and practice and so forth and so on. So other traditions that are leftist or that are progressive or forward-looking or whatever, however you want to express it, have not, necessarily grasped onto that word theory and said, well, that's what we're doing. We're doing theory. Then we'll turn that into practice. So Anyway, but there can also be a problem of being lost in theory, and theory can be distant from experience. It can be distant from actual on the ground, the experience of everyday life, and also the experience of everyday activism. So theory is not a magic sauce in that way, but the lack of theory certainly is. I feel like I'm seeing that a lot on the left, and I'm seeing also the weakness of the left and its lack of cohesion, in my view, springing from its let's say old-fashioned or I would say antiquarian theories. Among among those antiquarian theories or antique theories are the theories of Marx, and those theories are not entirely antique, and they are not entirely out of touch with reality, but they need to be sorted through, and that's why I'm for a from the ground up critique of Marx, and I've written about a 40-page draft of such a critique, and I haven't yet. It was, about a year ago or so that I wrote it, and I need to return to it and then see what I can do to make it into. I could make it into a series of videos, maybe. It would be a lot of videos, and it would be dealing with abstract themes. And maybe you can, in the comments section of this video, you can say, well, or I can just try a couple of videos and see what people think about it. But I would also want to maybe write it down and try to publish it. It's not yet book length, so but anyway, and maybe it doesn't have to be book length, but but this, and I'm not selling that. I mean, I don't have anything to sell right now, and in that area, but the ideas certainly have occurred to me, and I think the ideas are worth talking about, and that's why I'm talking about it here on Politics 2100. So anyway, so I think that even though there are very few people now who call themselves Marxists, and it's not necessarily a fashionable thing to be, and I don't think it necessarily should be, but and in fact, relative to my life experience as a political activist and so forth and so on, it's a time when it's actually less popular than it was in the early 80s when I first became politically active, and also definitely less so than in the 1970s and 1960s, when there were a full-scale after the student movements essentially failed to achieve their objectives, or they split apart, or they spun out of in various forms, spun out into different factions and so forth and so on. They embraced lots of mostly Marxist, not only Marxist, but mostly Marxist theory, and different strains in it and so forth and so on. They became sectarian. There are groups today that still exist that are the product of that spinning off into various, many of them Marxist-Leninists or Trotskyist sects and so forth and so on, which are versions of Marxism and or Marxism-Leninism. But anyway, but I don't think, in my perspective, people have gone back to the source, Marx, and thought about the basic steps and missteps that Marx made, and how, especially from the perspective of our current situation in the world. So, and what we need to do to, among other things, rescue the human species, because that we're currently on the path to extinction, and that's something that should be the mission of anybody who wants to act politically, who has a vision of even a sustainable society, which is not necessarily, or even a just society, egalitarian society, a better society than we have now, something improved the society of some kind. So um, part of that, the dossier, part of the agenda of that group should be prevent humanity from going extinct. So um, I think a critique of Marx, I don't think Marx himself has the answers to that, but I think a critique of Marx will lead us to some of the places where we need to go to create this theory that I'm saying needs to be there, or at least some kind of a hunch, let's say a series of intuitions and hunches that come from that critique that guide us correctly to make wise decisions politically. Um, so anyway, so the and just to sort of to go into a little bit more about the antiquarian side of things, and my perception at least of it is that I perceive the people who are closest to Marx or Marxism, like Jacobin and DSA, I'm talking about in the United States, that they seem to be kind of old souls in a way, or I mean, most of them are younger than me in terms of their calendar age, but they seem to be focused very much on reconstructing something from the past in a way, or occupying positions that are analogous to things that existed in the past, and they have not absorbed, in my opinion, some of the more interesting non-Marxist thinking of the last 40 years or 50 years, and also sort of kept in. They're sort of keeping a club. They're making a clubhouse of sort of like people who collect Pez dispensers or something, or artifacts of the 70s or artifacts of the 50s or 60s or 40s, that kind of antiquarian interest. And so and so and it occurs to me that to be really effective as political thinkers, they need to break out of that prison, in my opinion. So that's why I think going back to, even though some of these people don't consider themselves to be orthodox Marxists or so forth and so on, I think they are still within the prison of Marxism or the framework that Marxism created for leftism and for being left. And I see that being played out in a number of areas with regard to, for instance, climate action, with regard to also the Ukraine crisis, or the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the fate of internationalism and anti-imperialism in an era when we have an illiberal imperialist power that is trying to invade and destroy a smaller nation that is attempting, in my opinion, to create some of the features of a liberal society within its borders, and which are none of which are in the sort of the framework, I think, of at least how Marxism has evolved, or at least certainly it's almost pre-Marxist in a way. It's Marx. Marx thought that there were these stages of modes of production. So there was the feudal mode of production, and then there was the capitalist mode of production. And so liberalism, even though Marx didn't have a very developed political theory, he considered himself to be an economist, and his politics is superstructural in his model of the society. It's not, the base is the class struggle around the means of production, and not the state is epiphenomenal to that. Anyway, that lack of a theory of anyway, but beside that, so if we're assuming that Marx thought that liberalism associated with capitalism, it's pre-Marxist to be involved in a struggle where you're saying, well, no, these people need to still do the bourgeois revolution. So we have to defend the bourgeois revolution in Ukraine. I'm using old Marxist language to talk about this, and against, I don't know what you'd call the either Asiatic mode of production or, feudal. He's not. I mean, some people could say that Putin is a neo-feudalist and so forth and so on. I'm. There's probably better ways. There are better ways to talk about Putin and Putinism than what I just said. But trying to use Marx's framework to describe what's going on there anyway brings us back to a time that was Marx thought that his politics was starting on the basis of a liberal or bourgeois capitalist revolution. After the bourgeois capitalist revolution would be the socialist revolution, and he was going to, or communist revolution. That was what he and the communists, small c communists of the 19th century were attempting to lead, with the proletariat as being the class that would push or overthrow the bourgeois state and capitalist rule to then start the creation of socialism. So anyway, that framework, even though I'm using language that's from early Marx or from the period of the 19th century to some degree, and that framework is still embedded in many people's assumptions about what is it to be progressive and left and so forth and so on, and also how we should build a new society. And so, and who are the progressive forces? Okay, who are the people who are going to be the building the building blocks or of that society? Who are not the blocks, but the agents, really is a better word. So anyway, so I think we need this critique of Marx. I think, and I can, among other things, sustainability is another huge issue that while some people think that Marx is a good place to start for a critique of the capitalist, devastation of nature, and if you add a certain terms and so forth and so on into Marx, it works somewhat better as a starting place for building a sustainable society. It's still, in effect, though, it doesn't, and I will make the case for that either in writing or here on Politics 2100, that he downgrades the issues related to sustainability because he's so focused on intrahuman conflict between two classes that he doesn't understand our overall dependence on the natural world, and he's assuming in a way that it's an infinite, he doesn't use this language and so on, but there's an infinite a template, a tabula rasa of nature upon which human society then creates whatever it creates. And so, and unfortunately or fortunately, whatever it is, that isn't the case. And we need to reckon with the finitude of the earth and the laws of thermodynamics, among other things. So, and it's not as though Marx was any worse than many economists. In fact, he's somewhat slightly better than some economists, but still, almost all economists don't deal with that at all. They deal with a world of abstractions that assumes that there can be an infinite growth and infinite, and really there's that supply and demand. It depends on which kind of economist you are following. is all based on basically subjectivity and not the objective world simply just comes in as a it's not built into the basic model. It comes in at the end, deus ex machina, okay, at the end of one's theory or one's statement, whatever it is, and says, okay, well then, we had this and this physical things happening that affected supply and demand differently, or affected the class struggle differently, so forth and so on. So anyway, and I can make this clearer if I focus on that in a particular video. But anyway, or written document. So, and there are other reasons why, the Marxist framework or Marx's framework sets people off, I think, in a way, on a trajectory that isn't focused on the task we have to do now, and for that matter, I think tasks we would need to do anyway in the future very well. It's a good place to start. I'm glad that someone in the 19th century tried to do something about the contradictions, you can call them, of capitalism, the fundamental flaws of capitalism, and I wish that more people had chimed in, and it hadn't been codified so much in a school, but more had been a active process that more economists had pitched in upon. But anyway, and some of that has to do with exactly the political, the power of money and of the power of capitalists to suppress knowledge and suppress of knowledge of capitalism and also suppress our ability to imagine a society different than our current society. So I'm hopeful that this can be a place where we can do some of that imagining and talking about it. And so this is my kind of intro to that here on Politics 2100. So anyway, so if you have any reactions to what I said, I touched on a lot of different ideas in this video. Please share that in the comments below. If you like this presentation, please like the video, and also if you're liking the stuff on Politics 2100 more generally, please subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.